Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I mean, there's a certain awe before these horrible events that needs to be maintained. And yet, the other side of it is that we have to keep the memory alive, and that's been one of the notions of the survivors of the Holocaust, and I know it's been dear to this part of the Jewish community. We must keep the memory alive of these events so that they cannot happen again.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Rabbi Alan Sakobin. Father Bacik and Rabbi Sakobin will discuss the horrors of Kristallnacht, moving towards dialogue and reconciliation. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Alan, I'd like to speak with you a little bit about Jewish-Christian relationships. You being a rabbi and me being a Catholic priest, I guess we come out of that from our traditions and background. And as we begin to think about that, it seems important to me to put that in an historical context. We can never talk about the relationships today, I think, without looking at the history and how we've gotten to this point. And I want to focus especially on Kristallnacht, the infamous couple-day period when the Nazis under Hitler really went public, I suppose, with their whole effort to put down the Jews. And I think it's important, again, to see a little bit of history of that, and I know we'll get to that as we go along, but it wasn't just in 1938 when Kristallnacht occurred that Hitler began his efforts to rid Germany of the Jews, or at least to keep them in check in his mind. It goes back, I know in 1933 there was already a boycott of Jewish businesses, and in 1934 Hitler signed decrees that expelled Jews from the civil service, the medical profession, and so on. So all the way along up till 1938 you had a history of the Nazi regime beginning to persecute the Jews. So maybe we can, I want to focus in on Kristallnacht and the importance of that occasion, and to begin to reflect on that with you.
Actually, never has there been a case in history where someone said he would do something where people didn't believe it, but then he did it clearly in a developed way. Hitler, in his book, Mein Kampf, said that he intended to focus his venom on the Jews. And from the moment that he became Chancellor of Germany in 1933...
Mein Kampf takes us all the way back to 1924, yes. So you have a long period of time here.
So the moment he became Chancellor of Germany, having been elected by a plurality of the Germans, he began a series of enactments, a series of laws, which excluded Jews from the mainstream of German life. The difference was that in those earliest years, he and the Nazi Party that controlled Germany intended to limit the place of Jews in society and the economic life of the country, and to force them to leave, to force them to flee. By 1938, it is clear that they had made a decision not to force Jews out, but rather to keep them in Germany and to exterminate them. Therefore, what happened on Kristallnacht was the first overt action wherein they began to gather Jews together, to assemble them, to bring them into concentration camps. 30,000 people were taken away during that period of time into camps.
This is on Kristallnacht,
yes,
which was November
9th and 10th.
9th and 10th
50
of
years ago.
1938. Right, that's 50 years ago.
And therefore, I suggest that it's clear that one doesn't build camps for 30,000 people overnight, that this was a part of a clearly defined program leading to the extermination of the Jews. What bothers me about that night, and I remember it with great clarity, I was 12 years old at that time.
Where were you living?
I was living in New Jersey, but every Jew the world over knew. Everyone knew because of the nature of the barbarism. Today, in terms of what happened, it seems small, but in those days it was an immense barbarism that was perpetrated.
Well, I mean, even
Jews.
the numbers are large. I'm seeing numbers like 267 synagogues were burned, 7,500 Jewish businesses and firms destroyed, more than 10,000 Jewish apartments destroyed, 11 of Germany's largest Jewish cemeteries violated, and this large number thrown into the concentration camps, as you point out. So, I mean, there is a magnitude to it in itself.
It was nationwide, and nationwide included all of Germany and Austria, because Austria was already a part of the German Reich. And what they did was they probably well over 1,000, 1,100 synagogues that were destroyed. But what they did on a personal level, I remember, as I say, I was 12 years old, and in those days we would go to movies to see the news of the week. There was a program I recall was called The March of Time. And I remember, and it is burned into my mind and memory and soul, pictures of a 75-year-old rabbi, the chief rabbi of Vienna, the day after Kristallnacht, on his hands and knees, surrounded by Nazis who were taunting and laughing, with his bare hands being forced to gather the glass together. His hands were a bloody, bloody cut mess, and they were forcing him. It was the Germans that called it Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. But it was not broken glass. It was broken human souls and broken thoughts and broken ideals and broken hopes and broken prayers for the future. It was the breakdown of the possibility of any reconciliation. The wrong word. It wasn't a question of reconciliation. The Jews didn't want to be persecuted. It was the hope of any possibility that the Nazis would not live up to their promise to exterminate the Jews.
Yes, it carries with it such an emotional weight as you're describing it. And I always think it's important for Christians to listen a lot when this is the topic, and to be careful about not saying glib things. It's one of my sensibilities about how Christians need to enter the Jewish-Christian dialogue. I mean, there's a certain awe before these horrible events that needs to be maintained. And yet, the other side of it is that we have to keep the memory alive, and that's been one of the notions of the survivors of the Holocaust, and I know it's been dear to this heart of the Jewish community. We must keep the memory alive of these events so that they cannot happen again. Again, unfortunately, the events in Nazi Germany, triggered by Hitler's demonic attitude and all of this, those events have to be put into a larger context. And unfortunately, we have a whole history of Christian persecution of Jews since the time of Christ. And I think right within the New Testament we have to recognize that there are ideological elements. There's a certain anti-Semitism built right into the New Testament. You can see it clearly when you compare the Gospel of Mark with the Gospel of Matthew, which was written later. At times, in Mark's Gospel, Pharisees or scribes will approach Jesus in a very open attitude, seeking dialogue and seeking his wisdom or what he has to say. Just a few decades later, when Matthew reports the same events, we see the scribes and Pharisees coming up to Jesus, always with some sort of malice in their hearts, or attempting to trick Jesus and so on. So right away in the New Testament period, in the first century, we have an anti-Semitic element built right into the founding religious documents of Christianity. I think for us Christians, it's important to uncover any of that anti-Semitic ideology that's found there. And I think that you can take this then throughout history, and the history we can't portray it all, but it is a dark and terrible history. And we have times in the medieval period when the popes in Rome did things that sound an awful lot like what Hitler was doing in the early times, that is, forcing Jews to wear distinctive garb, keeping them out of the mainstream of the culture, and so on.
One of the reasons that Kristallnacht was the night of broken dreams was because the Jews who are not as theologically concerned with some of the elements that you just brought saw their hopes shattered. We saw in the 19th century and the earlier part of the 20th century in Christianity a new openness, a new friendliness, an opportunity for peoples to reach across the gulf of strangeness and to touch one another and to learn from one another, particularly in Western Europe, particularly in Germany. And it was not only the fact that Hitler and his followers perpetrated this act. One of the things that shattered the dreams was the silence of the religious communities of Europe. The silence of the churches of Europe was louder in some ways than the shattering of the glass. And it was a period of absolute loss of hope. because we said to ourselves, if in a world where we see communications developing, where we see the possibility of speaking to people around the world, if we can't speak to the person next to us because of a barrier of hate that keeps him or her from hearing our cry and our pain, then this world has no hope whatsoever. If Kristallnacht represents anything to me personally, it is that not only was our pain so great that others had to listen, that it was the beginning of the end for the Jewish people of Europe. 6 million were killed in the years that followed, but it was also, in a strange and paradoxical way, the end of, or the beginning rather, of the breakdown of that barrier. The fact that you and I, a rabbi and a priest, can sit and discuss this with openness and with the bearing of the intimacy of our feelings, of shared pain. You just said to me in a way, I really feel what you have lived through. And I can respond to you and say that it is only when we feel each other's pain that we begin to understand who we are and what we are. It is not the same world that I lived in when I was 12 years old. 50 years later, you and I, who 50 years ago would not have spoken, institutionally, the rabbinate and the priesthood did not communicate. As a matter of fact, there were priests who were, as you know, leaders in the movement to continue discrimination against the Jews.
I think we might as well name a name there, if you want.
Father Coughlin, who
many people know, and
who just died recently in Detroit.
That's right, very close to us here, and is well known and even well thought of in Catholic circles by certain people. I mean, he represented a distinctive philosophy, as we know. But I think it's important to say it, that there were anti-Semitic elements in what he had to say, and that was broadcast widely, and he became a nationally known figure. And I think that kind of thing has to be said. I think it has to be exposed on the theory that, if we just let that sort of thing remain in the darkness, then we don't know our history, then we don't know how to come together in constructive ways.
But again, and I don't know all of the people within the various churches, and I don't know all of them in terms of some of the darker recesses of their own souls. But I do know a goodly number of people here in Toledo who have in a multitude of ways said we have to put those dark days behind us, and we have to build bridges of understanding, of compassion, of concern. We have to create a future that has light and hope.
There's no doubt about it. I mean, and I think that's the direction that we really have to move in. I could respond a couple of ways to what you have just been saying here. I mean, one is at the emotional level, where I think it's so important that we try to have empathy for one another. I remember Elie Wiesel saying that suffering was good for only one thing, and that is to learn that you shouldn't inflict it on others. Maybe some of us would want to expand that a little bit, but it does remind us that, suffering, as we've known, the monstrous suffering has to teach us lessons. We have to learn about it. And I think part of what I would get out of Kristallnacht is that notion that if good people stand aside when evil is being perpetrated, then evil will triumph. I think it was Edmund Burke that reminded us of that truth, and I believe that that's something we should learn here. Because the whole thing went very public at that point. Although I'm going back, what was it, 1935? They had what they called the Nuremberg race laws, defining who a Jew was, and putting certain discriminatory measures upon them. So it was going on, and I won't say it wasn't public, but here it reached a sort of crescendo that it was hard to avoid. Now, what we had, it seems to me, in the Christian community in Germany is a couple things going on. One, I think we must point to Karl Barth here in the so-called Barmen Declaration, which did castigate Hitler for his policies and speak out against him and speak out against the anti-Semitism that was going on. They formed what we called at that time the Confessing Church in Germany. which was a group of people led by Karl Barth, the great Protestant theologian, and others who did see the problem and did speak out. And so we had a minority, in other words, who understood what was at stake and had great courage. We had Dietrich Bonhoeffer, another Christian theologian who was eventually killed himself by the Nazi regime, who was even involved in a plot to kill Hitler to stop these terrible atrocities. So we do have the stories of the individual heroes. Raoul Wallenberg comes to mind, people like that. But on the other hand, we had this great silence. No, one important Catholic theologian by the name of Johann Metz, who still teaches in Germany today, pointed out that Hitler really did fear the Catholic bishops. And that was a force that he wasn't exactly sure how he was going to reckon with. In other words, the Catholic bishops had clout. They could have exercised their authority at this point and their political leverage to try to temper what Hitler was doing. And one of the great I suppose critiques of them is that they did not speak out, that they remained more among the silent people at that time.
One of the mysteries that I have never been able to come to grips with was, on the basis of the Nuremberg laws, anyone who had one Jewish grandparent was considered Jewish by the Nazis. I was in Terezin, in a concentration camp in Czechoslovakia just 2 weeks ago, and therefore what I saw and what I was told remains very hot within my being. 12% of those who were put into that concentration camp as Jews were not Jews. 12%, more than 1 out of every 10, were believing, confessing Christians. And they were put into concentration camps for being Jewish because either their parents or grandparents were Jewish. And the church was quiet and silent with regard to them as well. I think I was not old enough to, nor was I there personally, to have the physical pain of what was inflicted upon so many, but the pain of loneliness, the awful, exquisite pain of loneliness, of feeling the solitude and despair because of the silence of others, is something that reverberates to me after a half a century. The Jewish people felt not only betrayed, but they felt abandoned.
And very often that was the case, and abandoned by the Christian culture as a whole. I see what you're saying there. I just, to my own personal remembrance as a tourist going through Dachau, is one of the most striking things that I've ever gone through in my life, and I've never sort of recovered from it in a way. It's burned into my mind and heart, and I know when the television programs appear and so on dealing with the Holocaust, I usually cannot watch them. And but anyway, that experience with Dachau, it sort of engulfed my being at the time, and it has never let me go since, really. And but however, I think again, Christians have to be really careful. There's no way Christians can totally empathize with what the Jewish community went through. There's a limit to this ability to identify, and I think we're always the outsiders in that. And I think we have to remember and talk about it, and that helps to sharpen it for us. But we still remain the outsiders to that particular pain. We can look for solidarity in other ways and ways to move beyond and maybe join closer together. But I just think we always see it as outsiders, not from the inside.
Jim, even though other people may be listening to this is a very intimate conversation, that I don't understand that statement, because it seems to me that Christians focusing in on Jesus of Nazareth and his last statements, he felt abandoned. At a moment in time, he felt abandoned. And I think that's the whole point of that phrase, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you abandoned me?
Mm-hmm.
And that's precisely the way the Jew felt, not only abandoned by God at that moment, but abandoned by a sister faith that espouses the same ideals and the same hopes and the same purposes.
Well, there's no doubt. Everybody has a sense of abandonment. We all know that, and and it's one of the more painful experiences in life. But I mean, there are a lot of other pains connected with the Holocaust, to say nothing of the physical pains. I mean, which are unbelievable and really indescribable, I think. So, I mean, I'm not saying that our solidarity comes in looking for ways that we can empathize with one another. I think that's true. And when you put it in terms of abandonment, then that throws me back on my own experiences of where I would feel abandoned and alone, and then that helps me to understand what you might be talking about. So that's why language and common experiences can bring us closer together. I have a feeling, though, and I say this in any context, not just this, but we eventually grieve alone. So a great painting by Picasso with a parent, two parents standing on a beach and a little child there, and there's a space in between the two parents. I read the painting as it's called a tragedy, something of saying that their youngster drowned in the sea. I mean, that's how I see it. I don't know what it really means, but it's the space between them that's always struck me. Mm-hmm. I have that sense we eventually grieve alone, and that doesn't mean we can't try to empathize with one another, and I think it's crucial that we do. But there's a uniqueness about our suffering, I think, that always escapes the observer from the outside. No, I mean, whatever the truth of all of that is and how we come closer together, the real task, of course, stated by Kristallnacht, as you've pointed out, is then how do we move beyond it, and how do we establish bonds of solidarity, how do we improve our relationships. I mean, one way that the Catholic community tried to do that was in the Second Vatican Council, a very halting effort and a flawed effort in many ways, but in a document dealing with the Jewish community, to try to make sure that we Christians didn't get into some sort of crazy, absurd notion of saying that the Jews are a deicide people, God killers, that we try to get that into some better context for ourselves, and that we give Judaism a place on the world stage, a legitimate world religion, so that Christians are not dealing with Jews just in terms of, well, we're going to try to convert you, and that's the only way we can deal with you. Second Vatican Council wants to say, no, we have to respect Judaism. It's the mother religion for us. We flow from that. Jesus himself is a Jew, and Mary is a Jew, and Joseph those are all Jewish members of the Jewish community, and Jesus lived the life of a Jew, and therefore, I mean, it's crazy, it's absurd to try to put down the Jewish community, in a sense, to define ourselves over against it with that kind of background. So we have a much more open response. So part of the Catholic community response to Kristallnacht and to the Holocaust is to say, let's clear our minds of these prejudices, especially these theologically based prejudices, so that we can move forward towards cooperation.
I think, again, what we are doing in this conversation and the other things that we shall share in dealing with Kristallnacht, where we shall stand together in commemorative moment, speak more loudly than the sound of shattered glass. I really do believe that we in Toledo, I don't know that it's true the world over, I doubt it is, and it certainly is not true in every part of these United States, but we in Toledo have something which I value and find to be very precious, that we can create relationships, not that we agree on everything, not that we support each other on every issue that is important, one to the other, but that we can create a relationship based upon mutual trust and mutual understanding, no more than that, mutual respect, that we respect each other as part of differing religious communities and say, I'm willing to listen. I may not always like what you say, but I'm willing to listen, and I'm not going to hate you for disagreeing with me, and I'm not going to despise you for being different, and I'm not going to want to obliterate you because you're not created in my image. What we're really saying is going back to what the essence of faith is, that we are, that each of us, as different as we may look and as different as we may speak and act, we are still all of us in the image of the divine.
Right, and that becomes our common ground, I think, and the common ground we have to really play on and build on. I mean, I think you spoke that beautifully, Alan, and I think that, it does represent some good things that we see. It's one of those signals of the hope in our own culture here that says that it's possible to move forward and to sort of attack those, from our viewpoint, the lingering bits of anti-Semitism that we find within our own community. We have to root those out. And I agree with you, there's a larger spirit that encompasses that, and it enables good things to happen.
I think one of the genius of the history of the Jewish people are those moments in time when we had tragedy and we were able to use those tragedies as opportunities, as moments when we could turn toward creativity and constructive ways of being a part of our world and a part of our cosmos. And I really do believe that Kristallnacht and what we are doing 50 years later, the tragedy then offers us an opportunity now to make a world that will shine a little better, that will glow in a way that offers greater hope and greater potential, not only for ourselves and the next generation, but for the next generations.
Alan, that's again beautifully spoken, and I appreciate it, and I agree with you that there's a sort of emotional tone to the conversation, which I think is proper, and it's an attempt to empathize with one another, especially from the Christian perspective, to see the importance of Kristallnacht has almost become a symbol in a way of evil in the world, and then to begin to look how we can overcome it. I always want to do that in a positive light. From my own religious Christian perspective, as saying there's always hope. There's a God who's with us. We are, as you said, what binds us together. We are made in God's image, and that allows us to talk and to move forward.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Rabbi Alan Sokoban. The topic of this week's Reflections was the horrors of Kristallnacht, moving towards dialogue and reconciliation. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.